Yemeni political parties have performed dismally in recent decades. This has both spurred, and been spurred on by, the failure of politics in general in the country, which culminated in the outbreak of war almost 6 years ago. Yemen's political parties today have abandoned their positions as national power brokers capable of pushing forward a political process to end civil strife and assumed the position of warring parties. The parties have adopted varied roles in the warring camps, including committing to alliances with regional powers interfering in Yemen. The ramifications of such distorted positions will have a rippling effect on Yemen's future. In particular, leftist and Arab nationalist parties' institutional structures have weakened and fractured, altering their historic place in Yemen's public sphere. As their political clout has declined, their popular base has been left vulnerable to polarization by more effective and better organized local powers. This has meant that while leftist and Arab nationalist parties have engaged in the war either through pushing their supporters to the front lines, backing the internationally recognized government and state institutions, or having their local organizations succumb to the control of the de facto authorities, they have nevertheless remained weak in the political and military power balance in Yemen. The Yemeni Socialist Party, YSP, represents a vivid example of what has become of the Yemeni left. A chain of political missteps over the years and a misguided repositioning including its response to the war has pushed the YSP away from its historic role as a party that sided with the working and peasant classes and put common national interest ahead of other considerations. Founded in the late 1970s, the YSP, in its early stages, championed issues of social justice. This included the integration of marginalized communities, such as nomadic Bedouins, as well as pushing for a progressive family law that empowered women politically, economically, and socially. Even after the YSP's single-party rule in South Yemen ended in 1990 when the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen in the south merged with the Yemen Arab Republic in the north to form the Unified Republic of Yemen, the party continued to unequivocally take the side of disadvantaged classes. Over time, however, this legacy faded as the YSP gradually abandoned its moral and ethical positioning, a process that accelerated during the pre-war transitional period and then through the YSP's entanglement in the war. The party has ceased its endorsement of just causes that side with the common citizens' basic needs and civil rights, and it has failed to voice a clear stance against threats that could fragment the country. The YSP's moral degradation becomes more pronounced when contrasted with its historic legacy and its political literature. Instead, by avoiding controversy and maintaining a low profile to avoid being the target of other political powers, the party took a passive and ambiguous stance with regard to key intellectual and social issues. Its focus appears to have been carving for itself a zone of political safety, in return for some of its leaders receiving positions in state institutions. This political timidity has caused huge disappointment among leftists in Yemen, who were expecting their party to adopt an honorable position that radically sided with people's daily struggles. The YSP's remaining constituency and supporters have found themselves abandoned by their party at a fundamental level. Critically, the YSP utterly failed to shape a third option for Yemenis, to step out of the dichotomies of war and offer an alternative to the current conflict's modalities. Instead, it slipped toward representing the interests of militia groups. From avant-garde social party to morally adrift and institutionally ruptured. The evolution of the YSP since the 1970s is a result of the profound shifts that both unsettled and reshaped the party, and the choices made by the party to adapt. Most profound was the ideological shift. The YSP began as an avant-garde socialist party that, according to one of its founders, Abdul Fattah Ismail, established a secular state that eliminated social inequality and class stratification, and guaranteed freedom of religion. Decades later it had become a political party with no clear ideology that endorsed Islamic law as the source of all legislation ahead of the 2012 to 2013 National Dialogue Conference, even if publicly it continued to adopt typical leftist discourse. Recurring internal party crises, the most known is the bloody infighting of 1986 among the party's competing factions that left thousands dead, caused deep and lasting ruptures in the YSP and reduced its popularity in the south, which to this day the party is still attempting to restore. In the period following the unification of North and South Yemen in 1990 leading up to the 1994 summer civil war saw the targeting of the party's leadership by President Ali Abdullah Saleh's regime. This deprived the YSP of key figures who could have played an effective role in its renewal. Meanwhile, much of the remaining YSP leadership post-1994 defected to rival parties and political movements such as the General People's Congress, GPC, and later, the Southern Movement. Moreover, moving the party's headquarters to the north following unification affected its institutional structure and created organizational problems that led to divisions within the party's popular bases, particularly in villages in Taiz. This was most visible in the competition between socialists based in Jabal al-Sabir districts, and those in Ma'afar, Shamadan, and Samia districts, and internal competition within the Hugariya area. This struggle came at the expense of developing popular bases in other parts of the country including tribal areas, and undermined the party's institutional outreach. As a result, rivals such as the GPC and Islah began to eat away at the YSB's popular base, particularly in Hadramaut. More recently, the party has also had to compete with new political powers such as the Southern Transitional Council, STC, which seeks to appeal to the YSB's traditional southern base, and the armed Houthi movement, which recruited some of the party's leadership. On top of the institutional rupture suffered by the party, numerous local party bodies, instead of serving the party interests, obstructed new initiatives and ideas put forward by party members. This manifested in the YSB's failure to build on the political and popular momentum of the Youth Revolution of 2011. As a partner in the Joint Meeting Parties, JMP, which opposed Saleh's regime, it missed the political opening of 2011 to renew the party and adopt an inclusive national project. Defined by a concentration of power, at the margins of political relevance. Perhaps one of the most important reasons for the party's institutional structures rupturing and its overall political role shrinking has been the authoritarianism practiced by the head of the party, the Secretary General, and the concentration of decision-making powers at the top of the party. This is a condition that overshadowed the YSB's history, defined its internal struggles, and subsequently reflected on its performance. The party became synonymous with its Secretary General, who acted as the face of the party. In spite of the party's numerous substructures, from the grassroots to middle and top leadership, the direction of the party was defined by the whims, charisma, and popularity of a single figure. Reducing the party and its decision-making authority to the head of the party, represented by one person, is a condition seen not only among leftist and Arab nationalist parties in Yemen but in the region in general. Though the political leadership of the YSP attempted in recent years to activate the party's sideline substructures, redefine their role and separate them from the direct authority of the Secretary General, this did not solve the problem. Moreover, the fact that the current Secretary General, Dr. Abdul Rahman al-Saktaf, remains out of the country has paralyzed the YSP during the war and fragmented the party's political decision-making among its local organizations. These organizations continued to adopt minor and secondary causes that conformed with the narrow political margins allowed by the de facto authorities in their areas, rather than with national causes. This pushed the party as a whole to the margins politically as it failed to adopt a comprehensive position towards the country's fateful causes. These flaws transformed the party into a collection of small fiefdoms, active in Yemeni urban areas, at the expense of the party's national structure, which became an organizational void distant from its members. The lack of contact between the party base and its committee leadership paralyzed the work of the YSB's grassroots organizations in Yemeni cities, which have always been the party's main strength. This left YSP members exposed and politically vulnerable to polarization by other parties and groups, leading some to defect to other parties or to be exploited as a political cover to legitimize local warring parties' actions in the war. Moreover, the YSB's legacy as the ruling party in a single-party state in South Yemen meant that the orientation of YSB's leadership was, to a certain extent, driven by its eagerness to restore its popularity in the south, or at least to guarantee its relevance as the custodian of the southern issue. This orientation became more salient in recent years. The southern origins of the party kept shaping its direction on key issues, not only in the unwritten rule that the party's Secretary-General must always be a Southerner, but also on how the party handled the Southern issue, a secondary, albeit important, issue at the expense of broader national issues. To this end, the YSP established a party structure in the South with full decision-making powers to ensure the party's relevance there, even if it contradicts decisions made at the party's higher official bodies. Still, it is clear that part of the YSP's chain of command moves to the tune of the Southern Street, even when that is in opposition to the party's political manifesto and historic stances. The fear gripping at the leadership of the party of losing its relevance in the South and being replaced by new formations established during the current war, such as the STC, led to YSP's political paralysis. Not only in the South but in Yemen in general. The party leadership's fear and political timidity stems, in part, from the historic guilt of being complicit in the unequal 1990 unification deal, which led to the 1994 Civil War, the South being looted by the Northern regime, and decades of Southern suppression by the government in Sana'a. This past trauma shaped the party's ambiguous official stances to the events witnessed in the South during this current war, where they did not dare support secession but didn't oppose it either. In this regard, the party's stance vis-a-vis the STC was ambiguous at best and eventually led many party members to defect to the secessionist group. Notably, the YSB's support for a two-state federal system, South/North, during the National Dialogue Conference alienated the party base and middle leadership that leaned toward secession for South Yemen. The continuous narrative of history is what determines the paths of states and parties. When it comes to the YSB's journey spanning more than 40 years, since its founding in 1978, there is a legacy that is reminiscent of the left's golden age, which has inspired the imagination of Arab intellectuals, a golden age that was short-lived for reasons that cannot be sufficiently detailed in the scope of this article. However, it's in fact possible to thoroughly examine the reality of the political fragmentation that the YSP suffers from today and the cumulative outcome of what has become of the YSP as an institution and not what has become of its members. Thus, highlighting the YSB's current situation and miscalculations is an attempt to bring attention to its past and ongoing mistakes so it can reactivate its role as a political power for the future, rather than as a party restricted at its top, lingering nostalgically in a dreamy past. Bushra al-Maqtari is a researcher with Sana'a Center, a journalist, and a novelist. Bushra was awarded the Johann Philipp Palm Award for Freedom of Speech and Press in 2020 and the François Giroud Award for Defense of Freedom and Liberties in 2013. A German translation of her book What You Have Left Behind, Voices from the Land of the Forgotten War was published in 2020, originally published in Arabic by Riyad El Reyes Publishers in 2018. Her writings have been published in various newspapers and periodicals, including The New Arab, New York Times, and Gulf House for Studies and Publishing. Many of her studies have approached the 2011 uprising in Yemen left. She authored Behind the Sun, a novel published by the Arab Cultural Center, and co-authored South Yemen Under the Left with Lebanese intellectual Fawaz Trabulsi. Yemen's Socialist Party and the Fragmentation of the Yemen Left, Sana'a Center for Strategic Studies. https://sanacenter.org/publications/analysis/12976. Even before talks between the Yemeni factions in Geneva had commenced last week, it was obvious they would not result in anything new. This was clear from the contradictory statements of the Yemeni factions and the people who represented each side. The Houthi delegation was composed of junior leaders, and their insistence on having twice the agreed number of participants in the delegation resulted in diverting the course of the talks to procedural issues. The government's delegation was no better, as it also was composed of junior politicians aligned with President Abd Rabbuh Mansur Hadi, with little experience of conducting negotiations on this level and whose participation was purely superficial. Both sides of the conflict have escalated their military operations. Failure on many levels. The causes of failure were not limited to the Yemeni factions. The UN contributed by changing the talks from between the government and the Houthis and the General People's Congress, the party of former President Ali Abdullah Saleh, to being between the delegations of Sana'a and Riyadh. Thus the government was to take part as a political faction equal to the Southern Hirak movement, the Houthis, and Saleh's party. Placing Yemeni factions on an equal footing in the talks did not go as the UN had hoped, as the factions did not compromise on their positions, despite the UN presenting a draft agreement that proposed a ceasefire and a timetable for the withdrawal of Houthis from cities. The Houthis, however, insisted the ceasefire should be implemented without conditions and rejected any international mechanism to observe either the ceasefire or the withdrawal of troops. The Riyadh delegation, on the other hand, insisted on the withdrawal of the militias and the pro-Saleh forces from Aden and Taiz as a precursor to any ceasefire. The Geneva talks, the first unsponsored meeting between Yemeni factions since the start of the war, ended in abject failure, with parties not even agreeing on a humanitarian truce that would have made a world of a difference to the Yemeni population. Meanwhile, both sides of the conflict escalated their military operations. A day before the talks began, the Houthi and pro-Saleh forces took control of the Al-Jaf province on the Saudi border, by which it secured the eastern entrance to Saida province, the Houthi stronghold, eliminating the possibility of an ground invasion by Saudi forces. Battles also intensified between the Houthi and pro-Saleh forces on one side and the pro-Hadi troops on the other. Further, the Saudi-led coalition ramped up its airstrikes upon a number of cities, indicating perhaps that the coalition wanted to go to Geneva with recent military victories under its belt. The results of the Geneva talks demonstrate that none of the Yemeni factions have any sympathy for the suffering of millions of Yemenis. The only person who pointed to the suffering of Yemenis due to the war and the importance called an urgent humanitarian truce was the UN's special envoy. Ignoring the human cost. It seems the humanitarian toll is not yet heavy enough for a political solution to be taken seriously. Yemeni factions have ignored and belittled the suffering of the population to utilize the conflict to their own advantages. The sad end of the Geneva talks indicates the military solution will remain the obvious answer to the Yemeni crisis, while a political solution is a long way off. The failure of the talks indicate the solution in Yemen should not start with the UN's desire to bring Yemeni factions together, but by the desire of the factions to be Yemeni first and foremost, which means prioritizing the suffering of fellow Yemenis over the gains they hope to achieve through war, and ceasing to be an obstacle to the solution. There are already numerous local and regional obstacles to a political solution in Yemen: armed militias that only know the language of violence, local parties that reduce the dreams of Yemenis to the return of the president from voluntary exile, and regional nations that view Yemen as a boxing ring in which they can test their might. It seems the toll is not yet heavy enough for a political solution to be reached, to prevent Yemenis from suffering further death and destruction in this regional cockfight. The Geneva talks ended in disappointment for the international powers, who wanted a political solution, but the disappointment was greater amongst Yemenis, fatigued by war, who had hoped for talks that would consider their tragedy, fear, and pain and stop the war, even if only for the duration of Ramadan. The Yemeni factions who met in Geneva did not think that these simple and legitimate hopes were worthy of consideration. Comment: while regional powers compete over their interests even within the Saudi-led coalition, Yemenis will only reap more crises and violence, writes Bushra al-Maqtari. The Yemeni crisis is becoming more complex, writes Bushra al-Maqtari AFP. Foreign assistance to any political group is based on a number of reasons, primarily the strategic interests of the foreign power providing the aid, and deals usually end up with some kind of dominance over the country being assisted. Foreign interests might overlap with the interests of the country in question, however the foreign interests are always prioritized, even if they contradict the interests of the country being assisted. This is the case with Yemen, which for more than 5 months has witnessed a bitter and costly war that has nothing to do with Yemenis, a war waged between regional powers for their own gains, while Yemenis reap only death and destruction. Meanwhile, the Yemeni crisis is becoming more complex, not only due to the struggle between the regional powers, but also due to the disagreements within the Saudi-led Arab coalition. The Saudi-led military coalition that was formed in March to support the authority of interim President Abd Rabbo Mansour Hadi is witnessing Saudi Emirati disagreements and competition. For Yemenis, these disagreements are very serious, because they relate to identifying the cities that will be liberated by the Saudi-led coalition, and the cities that will be left as open theaters of confrontation to wear down the enemy and internal warring factions. It was not easy for Saudi Arabia to form an Arab military coalition under its leadership to protect its strategic interests. The Saudi Emirati disagreements are also about the nature of their future influence in Yemen and their ability to formulate the future of the country and dictate the Yemeni parties that take part in the post-war Yemeni state. It was not easy for Saudi Arabia to form an Arab military coalition under its leadership to protect its strategic interests as a dominant regional power. However, it utilized its Arab media dominance to promote the image of an Arab unity that would intervene to quell the Houthi rebellion and reinstate the authority of President Hadi. Yet the apparent unity was merely a facade, and Riyadh had to resort to its vast financial resources to make deals with non-GCC members of the coalition. It struck a deal with Egypt and granted Sudan a reported investment deposit of $4 billion, in return for Sudan sending ground troops to Yemen. Divergent interests. Despite the dangers posed to the UAE's interests and security by alleged Iranian expansion in the region, the country has other motives behind participating in Operation Decisive Storm. The UAE hopes to expand its influence southwards, specifically to Aden, where it wants to control the city's port to ensure that it does not compete with the port of Dubai. Thus it has been working to create inroads with the Southern Hirak movement to gain political influence in the south. As dangerous as the Houthi coup had been to the UAE's interests, Abu Dhabi did not want the Saudis to destroy the Houthis, along with the forces loyal to deposed President Ali Abdullah Saleh, but merely wanted to force them from of the cities, while keeping them active in the political scene. This was due to the UAE's fear that eliminating the Houthi and pro-Saleh forces would lead to the Muslim Brotherhood, represented by Al-Islah Party, dominating the state in Yemen. The divergent views between Riyadh and the UAE on Al-Islah's role have slowly surfaced. For Saudi Arabia, however, despite its own reservations towards the Muslim Brotherhood, it views Al-Islah as the most effective local force to achieve its interests, in addition to viewing Emirati concerns as unjustified or a point of disagreement that should be postponed. Thus, Saudi Arabia has been working to utilize Al-Islah's tribal and military connections in the war and has even been working to enable the party to govern the country in the future. The divergent views between Riyadh and the UAE on Al-Islah's role have slowly surfaced with the participation of Emirati forces in the liberation of Aden, as, instead of heading towards the city of Taiz to liberate it from the siege imposed by the Houthis and their allies, UAE forces headed eastwards to clear the rest of the southern coast. The UAE views the anti-Houthi fighters in Taiz as being a Muslim Brotherhood force, while Saudi Arabia has done nothing to alleviate Emirati fears. On the contrary, it appointed an Islam member as the governor of Aden. The Saudi Emirati disagreements over the Muslim Brotherhood are becoming more entrenched, and are affecting the coalition's military operations, in addition to their local allies on the ground, including Al-Islah Party. However, while the regional powers and local Yemeni forces compete to reap the fruit of the storm, they ignore the fact that Yemenis will only reap more crises and violence, which is what led to this war in the first place. Comment: the crisis in Yemen is not just the fault of the country's volatile politics. It took the international community's help for things to get this bad, says Bushra al-Maqtari. UN Special Advisor on Yemen Jamal Benomar, Mission Impossible? Getty. The current political situation in Yemen has reached a complete stalemate. This stalemate raises many questions as to what the UN and the UN Security Council ever hoped to achieve in Yemen. Far from solving any of Yemen's problems, they have contributed to the country's current catastrophe. Ironically, the UN has exacerbated the failure of Yemeni political parties to manage the crisis on their own, or to come up with a solution that satisfies all parties to the conflict without resort to war. This peculiar reality confirms the frailty of Yemen's political elite and the overlap of regional and international conflicts. It also sheds light on the international community's role in complicating the situation in Yemen, and on the UN Special Advisor on Yemen, Jamal Benomar, a controversial figure, whose influence on the country's political processes cannot be ignored. Sidelined. The UN has exacerbated the failure of Yemeni political parties to manage the crisis on their own. In his briefing on the Yemen crisis before the UN Security Council on April 27, Ben-Ammar emphasized the horror of the war in Yemen, which has grown into a full-fledged confrontation, connected with domestic and regional agendas. He spoke about an imminent catastrophe in Yemen. He has repeatedly warned the Security Council about the systematic hindering of the country's political process over the past 3 years, but the Security Council did not deal with his warnings decisively enough. In addition, Ben-Ammar said the collapse of Yemen's political process was not the sole responsibility of one side, but rather a result of a complex situation for which every side is to blame, albeit to different degrees. According to Ben-Ammar, before the launch of the Saudi-led military operation in Yemen, political rivals had agreed on all issues except for the presidency. He added that the resumption of the political process and the achievement of stability in Yemen should be carried out through a Yemeni dialogue, where Yemenis make their own decisions, away from any foreign interventions or dictations. The UN Yemen envoy seemed to be pleading innocence before the world. His briefing infuriated many Yemeni and regional political powers, particularly for blaming the international community's dealing with the crisis as much as it blamed Yemeni factions. Ben-Ammar's briefing revealed the restricted space in which regional and international powers operated and how they viewed Yemen before Operation Decisive Storm. It also shed light on how regional and international players failed to heed to his repeated warnings of a civil war, and about the fragility of Yemen's political process. The international community appears not to have cared about Yemen's political conflicts, or the descent into violence after the Houthis took over Sana'a by force. Ben-Ammar's briefing was, however, not accurate as to the agreement between political rivals. Many Yemeni and international players were willing to sacrifice President Abd Rabbo Mansur Hadi and his legitimacy in return for stability in Yemen. They were willing to grant political leadership to the Houthis to curb their violence. However, this cannot be considered an agreement in the sense Ben-Ammar indicated. It was instead a temporary resolution to the crisis, but it was not meant to last. Many Yemeni and international players were willing to sacrifice President Abd Rabbo Mansur Hadi and his legitimacy in return for stability. Yemenis, especially those who were independent, had high hopes for the transitional period. Few relied on the ability of Yemeni political parties to overcome their differences, but they did bet the international community would pressure them and curb their madness and greed. They hoped the international mediator could end polarization and violence between political parties. Inadequacy. Ben-Ammar's weakness soon became clear, and his poor performance seemed to depend on pro forma settlements and provisional solutions for Yemeni rivals. This was in line with the international community's priorities, matching the political approach adopted by the UN, and how it dealt with the Yemeni situation. Reading UN resolutions on Yemen, one can clearly see how international players leaned towards a political solution to contain the situation and prevent it from escalating out of control, but did not try to find radical solutions. This is what the UN Yemen envoy said during the transitional period. Thus, the international resolution on Yemen focused on supporting the Gulf Initiative to resolve the disputes among political rivals. However, the initiative did not adopt a real solution for the Yemeni crisis. Its main advantage stemmed from its ability to postpone the slip into violence. However, a major loophole, named Ali Abdullah Saleh, the past president, destroyed any chance of success, as he threatened the consensus and played a leading role in further complicating Yemen's political future. It is unfair to crucify Ben-Ammar, who had been a trustworthy voice of the international community in dealing with the Yemeni crisis and who reliably conveyed the crisis facing Yemen's political forces. When Yemeni factions bypassed his preliminary steps to a comprehensive national dialogue, including the restructuring of the army, and then chose an arbitrary method to decide the participants of a national dialogue based on quotas, Ben-Ammar did not object to their stalling tactics, but welcomed them as solutions reached through consensus. What concerned Ben-Ammar and the international community was that dialogue continue in Yemen, even if only a superficial dialogue that would not resolve the fundamental reasons beneath civil conflict and mistrust between political factions. Further, when President Hadi exploited disagreements on the state's nature and announced the division of the country into 6 provinces, Benamar and the international community welcomed this disastrous fabrication. Does the international community understand it is partly responsible for the dire situation in Yemen? Thus, over the course of a year, the Yemeni dialogue ignored all main issues that should have been dealt with through serious and transparent talks. Ironically, the international community celebrated the Yemeni dialogue as a political achievement and a model for the international community's political success, and even proposed to use the Yemen model as a solution in Syria. Overlooking critical errors. Benamar and the international community did not pay attention to the political errors that allowed the Houthi militias to impose their will and force factions to sign the Peace and National Partnership Agreement after they took over Sana'a in September 2014. International actors and the GCC welcomed this unbalanced agreement, while accepting that Benamar and the rest of the international community would oppose it, to put an end to the Houthi rebellion and the political settlement the Houthis tried to impose. Benamar was working in accordance with the interests and vision of the international community, whose main concern was the announcement of a settlement, even if made under the threat of violence, to claim a victory for the United Nations in solving the Yemeni crisis. The obvious question is, has the international community finally understood it is partly responsible for the dire situation in Yemen and that it is time to protect Yemenis from the effect of regional and international conflict? How much Yemeni, Syrian, and Iraq blood does the international community need to be spilled before it will take real action, instead of just making bland media statements, to stop this war machine? Bushra al-Maqtari is a Yemeni feminist, activist, and author. What the civil war is doing to Yemenis. Houthis, forging on regardless. Perspectives. 4 minutes read. The New Arab Staff. Bushra al-Maqtari. March 5, 2015. Yemenis continue to suffer as the Houthis and President Hadi battle it out for control of the country. Hadi's escape to Aden gave Yemenis false hope. Getty. Yemeni optimism was short-lived after President Abd Rabbi Mansur Hadi escaped house arrest in Sana'a and traveled to Aden. Hadi's actions shook up the political scene stagnant since the Houthi takeover in September. The positive atmosphere, however, has been destroyed by new political nightmares appearing on the horizon. These nightmares will pave the way for a new political and geographical map of Yemen. This map will be the result of the stupidity of gamblers who are putting the country at risk, not of the millions of sacrifices made by Yemenis in their different revolutions over the past few decades. The Houthis' position is caused by a crisis of unilateral thought. Contrary to the hopes of Yemenis for some respite from the political storms ruining their lives, the Houthi position is caused by the group's fundamentalist belief in martyrdom and selection, even if that means burning the whole country and themselves in the process. During the siege of Hadi's house, the Houthi movement refused all political efforts to save the country from its current crisis. However, since his escape, the group's political thuggery has become more prominent. It has refused to read the new political realities and deal with them logically to prevent feudal wars and conflicts. Therefore, the group has continued its policy of dividing the country and leading it towards economic failure. The Houthis are pushing Yemen on this course by escalating the situation on the ground in preparation for a possible confrontation with Hadi, and by exacerbating political divisions that are driving a growing political, geographical, and sectarian wedge between the de facto authority they have imposed in Sana'a and Hadi's shaken authority in Aden. Having sabotaged the political process, the Houthis have tried to increase their influence over military and security institutions over the past few days. It is a pattern that was seen during the time of former President Ali Abdullah Saleh's Congress Party and the Islamist Al-Islah Party. The Houthi movement has also tried to restructure these institutions so that they serve the group's interests. They have replaced military and security leaders with people loyal to the group, and included their armed popular committees in the armed and security forces. Furthermore, Houthi militias in coordination with former President Saleh, have solidified their partial control of the strategic city of al-Baida by controlling its military bases as part of a plan to control the north of the country and use it as a launch pad to the south. The group also took control of the Coastal Defense Brigade in the city of Al-Hadida after intense fighting caused numerous causalities and led to the seizure of the headquarters of the Special Forces in Al-Subaha military base. This falls under the jurisdiction of the Republican Guards and its former commander Ahmed Ali Abdullah Saleh, eldest son of the former president. Therefore, pro-Saleh media notwithstanding, it looks likely that the Houthis will continue to use military force in the coming period and in cooperation with Saleh. The media denials can only be understood as an attempt to deflect pressure after international sanctions and threats to freeze Saleh's recently revealed wealth. In my opinion, the complexities of the current political scene do not differ from those of the military scene, which favors an alliance between the Houthis and Saleh. It is highly likely the next play made by political forces may be a military one. Yemen is crushed between the Rock of Hadi and the international community, and the hard place of the Houthis. On the other side of the disjointed political spectrum, President Hadi is trying to form a parallel political and military bloc that will solidify his political legitimacy, on the one hand, and increase the Houthis' political isolation on the other, especially as the regional and international context has shifted in his favor. However, Hadi does not seem to have a cohesive political front. The honeymoon with the Southern Iraq secessionist movement could end at any time. This may be caused by a political escalation on the ground, or because of the interference of regional powers using the Iraq to achieve their own interests. Furthermore, Hadi's military backing seems to be limited to popular committees in the city of Aden. He does not seem to have learned from his past political errors. His recent statements affirm he continues to insist on imposing federalism and the proposed draft constitution on the country. This has happened despite the reservations of many political forces. Yemen therefore is in a difficult position, crushed between the Rock of Hadi and the international community, and the hard place of the Houthis, both of which deny the people the right to determine their country's future. Between the threats of alienation, counter-alienation, the use of force, legitimacy, and foreign intervention, we are approaching a new chapter in the confrontation between a fundamentalist group and a president that wants to regain his stature. It seems the battle will be carried out over military and security institutions. Controlling them is the decisive factor in this battle. However, in the end, the only losers will be the Yemeni people who are already exhausted by this expensive political show. Houthis, forging on regardless. Perspectives. 4 minutes read. The New Arab Staff. Bushra al-Maqtari. March 5, 2015. Yemenis continue to suffer as the Houthis and President Hadi battle it out for control of the country. Hadi's escape to Aden gave Yemenis false hope. Getty. Yemeni optimism was short-lived after President Abd Rabah Mansur Hadi escaped house arrest in Sana'a and travelled to Aden. Hadi's actions shook up the political scene stagnant since the Houthi takeover in September. The positive atmosphere, however, has been destroyed by new political nightmares appearing on the horizon. These nightmares will pave the way for a new political and geographical map of Yemen. This map will be the result of the stupidity of gamblers who are putting the country at risk, not of the millions of sacrifices made by Yemenis in their different revolutions over the past few decades. The Houthis' position is caused by a crisis of unilateral thought. Contrary to the hopes of Yemenis for some respite from the political storms ruining their lives, the Houthi position is caused by the group's fundamentalist belief in martyrdom and selection, even if that means burning the whole country and themselves in the process. During the siege of Hadi's house, the Houthi movement refused all political efforts to save the country from its current crisis. However, since his escape, the group's political thuggery has become more prominent. It has refused to read the new political realities and deal with them logically to prevent feudal wars and conflicts. Therefore, the group has continued its policy of dividing the country and leading it towards economic failure. The Houthis are pushing Yemen on this course by escalating the situation on the ground in preparation for a possible confrontation with Hadi, and by exacerbating political divisions that are driving a growing political, geographical, and sectarian wedge between the de facto authority they have imposed in Sana'a and Hadi's shaken authority in Aden. Having sabotaged the political process, the Houthis have tried to increase their influence over military and security institutions over the past few days. It is a pattern that was seen during the time of former President Ali Abdullah Saleh's Congress Party and the Islamist Al-Islah Party. The Houthi movement has also tried to restructure these institutions so that they serve the group's interests. They have replaced military and security leaders with people loyal to the group, and included their armed popular committees in the armed and security forces. Furthermore, Houthi militias in coordination with former President Saleh, have solidified their partial control of the strategic city of al-Bayda by controlling its military bases as part of a plan to control the north of the country and use it as a launch pad to the south. The group also took control of the Coastal Defense Brigade in the city of al-Hadida after intense fighting caused numerous causalities and led to the seizure of the headquarters of the Special Forces in al-Subaha military base. This falls under the jurisdiction of the Republican Guards and its former commander Ahmed Ali Abdullah Saleh, eldest son of the former president. Therefore, pro-Saleh media notwithstanding, it looks likely that the Houthis will continue to use military force in the coming period and in cooperation with Saleh. The media denials can only be understood as an attempt to deflect pressure after international sanctions and threats to freeze Saleh's recently revealed wealth. In my opinion, the complexities of the current political scene do not differ from those of the military scene, which favors an alliance between the Houthis and Saleh. It is highly likely the next play made by political forces may be a military one. Yemen is crushed between the Rock of Hadi and the international community, and the hard place of the Houthis. On the other side of the disjointed political spectrum, President Hadi is trying to form a parallel political and military bloc that will solidify his political legitimacy, on the one hand, and increase the Houthis' political isolation on the other, especially as the regional and international context has shifted in his favor. However, Hadi does not seem to have a cohesive political front. The honeymoon with the Southern Iraq secessionist movement could end at any time. This may be caused by a political escalation on the ground, or because of the interference of regional powers using the Iraq to achieve their own interests. Furthermore, Hadi's military backing seems to be limited to popular committees in the city of Aden. He does not seem to have learned from his past political errors. His recent statements affirm he continues to insist on imposing federalism and the proposed draft constitution on the country. This has happened despite the reservations of many political forces. Yemen therefore is in a difficult position, crushed between the Rock of Hadi and the international community, and the hard place of the Houthis, both of which deny the people the right to determine their country's future. Between the threats of alienation, counter-alienation, the use of force, legitimacy, and foreign intervention, we are approaching a new chapter in the confrontation between a fundamentalist group and a president that wants to regain his stature. It seems the battle will be carried out over military and security institutions. Controlling them is the decisive factor in this battle. However, in the end, the only losers will be the Yemeni people who are already exhausted by this expensive political show. Comment: the civil war in Yemen is the worst the country has ever suffered, and it will deeply scar its people, says Bushra al-Maqtari. Yemenis wait to fill their containers with drinking water in Sana'a, Anadolu. There have been several civil wars in Yemen's recent history, for which the country has paid a high price. But the war currently being fought is definitely the most violent and complicated. During the previous wars in Yemen, neither the society nor the subsequent governments ever sought to uproot the causes of the conflict. The war caused social and political tensions that were never addressed, and transitional governments never successfully resolved the national crises or eased tensions, which were only deferred by political settlements. The policies and measures of the national consensus or unanimous governments only isolated the Yemeni society once again in peacetime and hampered its recovery. A war on two fronts. The civil war currently being fought is definitely the most violent and complicated of all the civil wars in Yemen's recent history. A violent war has been imposed on the Yemenis who are fighting on two fronts, an external front represented by the Saudi-led coalition to protect the president in exile, Abd Rabbo Mansur Hadi, and an internal conflict. The forces of the Houthi movement and its allies are fighting in defense of national sovereignty. The Houthi popular forces need to feel they belong to a strong military force, and to believe that the group is a resistance force, akin to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Forces loyal to the former president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, are fighting because their interests were threatened by the 2011 revolution. While allied with the Houthis, the pro-Saleh forces see the war a chance to restore their social and political influence. The complications emerging from the alliances at home have set Yemeni society in a constant fight against itself. Many wars are taking place at once, a war alongside or against the Saudi intervention, a civil war in the south, a sectarian war in central Yemen. Nonetheless, there are two justifications for Yemen's infighting: it is either in defense of Hadi's legitimate government or in defense of Yemen's sovereignty. Meanwhile, the situation in Yemen is likely to deteriorate at all levels, signaling a definite humanitarian catastrophe. According to the most recent survey conducted by the EU-affiliated Freedom House organization in Yemen, 2,571 people have died across the country, including 381 children and 214 women, while 3,897 others were injured, including 618 children and 455 women. Besides, 334 residential compounds came under attack, 2,265 houses were destroyed and 91 houses were demolished on their inhabitants. Because of non-stop missile attacks and armed clashes in residential areas, over 35,000 families have been displaced and the economic crisis continued to deteriorate with every passing day. Because of non-stop missile attacks and armed clashes in residential areas, over 35,000 families have been displaced. Businesses, companies, and most factories dismissed around 1,000 employees and Yemen ran out of food and fuel. The clashes have also left the country's main power station in Mareb out of service, bringing daily life to a complete halt. The Yemenis have turned into pawns in the hands of political and regional alignments, and political rivals settle their differences by force of arms. This has threatened the social unity of the Yemenis and left society unable to free itself from the choices of the feuding politicians. It has also hampered the formation of a force from within the society to defend the livelihood of the people. The use of weapons and the intolerant language used by Yemen's rivals silenced civil society, which is unable to practice any form of peaceful resistance. Other regional and sectarian forces have mobilized the people and justified their use of weapons and violence. Yemen's civil society, known for its peaceful behavior in all political battles it waged against previous political regimes, is now at risk. This movement has always represented a safety valve for Yemeni society and its aspirations, and has successfully prevented it from slipping into violence. The paralysis that plagues Yemen today is just scary, and so is the absence of any civil voice that could protect what remains of the country. Today, many worn-out Yemenis are left with no choice in the face of the internal violence and the unprecedented divide in Yemeni society. Faced with a tragic reality they did not choose, these Yemenis refuse to become a cover for local and regional interests, or mouthpieces for the Houthis or Saleh. However, they are unable to realize their dream of safeguarding their country and restoring its unity. Houthis change tack after President flees. Bushra al-Maqtari. February 26, 2015. Comment: Hadi's moonlight flight to Aden has upset the Houthis' plans, as they stood on the brink of entering into new political negotiations. The Houthis ransacked Hadi's house after his escape Anadolu. Only in Yemen do political events sometimes become unexpectedly and horrifying dramatic. At other times they become comical because they extend beyond our rational comprehension, forcing us to laugh at their absurdity to protect ourselves from despair. The Houthi takeover of state institutions on September 21, 2014 was a horrifying political development that took a dramatic turn when the government handed in its resignation to President Abd Rabbo Mansour Hadi, who in turn handed in his resignation to the parliament. The Yemeni government ended up in the hands of the armed Houthi militia that placed the president, prime minister, and defense and foreign ministers and others under house arrest. Events have since taken a dramatic turn, as Hadi escaped in the middle of the night from his besieged home in the capital, Sana'a, to the southern city of Aden, cementing the darkly comic character of Yemeni politics. Like most events in Yemen's political history, Hadi's escape is shrouded in mystery and subject to much debate. Delving into the details of Hadi's escape will not give us a real picture of the political forces currently shaping events in Yemen. However, like most events in Yemen's political history, his escape is shrouded in mystery and subject to much debate. As well as the confusion it created among political forces, the timing of Hadi's sudden escape on February 21, the same day he was elected president in 2012, is noteworthy. Did Hadi choose this date to try and restore his shaken legitimacy? Did he keep a few remaining political cards up his sleeve so he could coordinate his departure? This is especially significant as the Houthis have complete control over the capital, including over the houses of the president and prime minister. Undermining talks. Hadi's escape has undoubtedly bewildered Yemeni political forces, especially the Houthis, as it came at a time when they were entering into direct negotiations with some political forces. Media leaks from leading Houthi officials also suggested they were close to reaching an agreement on the formation of a presidential council to rule alongside Hadi, for parliament to keep its current form, and the formation of a transitional council to help parliament with its legislation. However, recent developments have shown the Houthis are no longer in complete control of Yemen's political scene, regardless of what they would like us to believe. Negotiations between political forces led by Jamal Benomar, the UN Special Advisor on Yemen, were suspended after Hadi's departure. This is because the Houthis were relying on Hadi's house arrest to give them political strength. With Hadi's escape, the Houthis have inadvertently found themselves in a new political crisis that puts them in direct confrontation with the only legitimacy recognized by the majority of Yemenis, that of the president, regardless of any issues they have with his past political performance. The Houthis will also have to face the masses that reject its militia authority in a number of governorates. Hadi's escape to the south, meanwhile, may provide him with southern and northern popular support and unite many political forces on the basis of preserving the legitimacy of a southern president. Hadi's escape is a final victory for the symbolism of the beleaguered Yemeni state he represents. Hadi's escape is a final victory for the symbolism of the beleaguered Yemeni state he represents. His statement against the coup and all the unilateral procedures that have been implemented by the Houthis since they took control of government institutions have raised hopes the move to Aden could pull the rug from under the Houthis and expose them as merely an armed group that staged a coup against the legitimate political authority. The move could also expose other political forces that have negotiated with the Houthis in order to achieve their own non-nationalistic interests. As much solace as the president's statement gave Yemenis who fear a further deterioration in the political and economic situation, there are fears Yemeni political forces will fail to use this opportunity to restore legitimate order and start a dialogue about the future of Yemen away from the coercive power of militias and armed groups. There are also concerns about how the Houthis will react to these latest developments. We cannot predict what will happen, but what is clear is that Yemenis will experience further dramatic and comical political events. They may even witness the fall of political elites and the rise of forces that cannot defend the country against the warring militias, with armed groups fighting to control the future direction and resources of the country. Yemenis will also have to ask themselves whether they now have a president that can actually govern them at all. Yemen, a nation torn apart. Bushra al-Maqtari 12 Feb. 2015. Comment: the Houthi takeover has plunged the country into a dark cycle, and shows the failure of revolution in a country that has been forsaken by international and regional powers. Security was tight as the Houthis made their constitutional declaration Anadolu. The only way Yemenis resemble other nations' citizenry is in their dreams and revolutionary aspirations. The only thing Yemenis receive from their homeland is disappointment and broken promises of the humanity they deserve. Only in Yemen do calamities come in droves and last longer than most people's lifespans. Just like every noble revolution, the oppressed united at the start of 2011 to topple the dictatorship of Ali Abdullah Saleh, president of Yemen from 1990 to 2012. Unlike other revolutions, however, Saleh was not forced into exile, put on trial, or degraded as Gaddafi was in Libya. However, Yemenis suffered from an agreement between forces domestic and foreign to suffocate their revolution and ignore their interests and hopes. Yemen had the bogeyman of Saleh, who was ousted by the revolution. Even after his departure, Saleh continued to strike fear among Yemenis. Those fears were only increased by the Islamist al-Islah party's appropriation of other political forces and its appetite to devour everything. Yemenis then had two bogeymen, Saleh and al-Islah, with each using the other to scare and blackmail the population. Only in Yemen do calamities come in droves and last longer than most people's lifespans. Today, Yemenis have a third bogeyman, the Houthi group that has allied with its arch-nemesis, Saleh. This group also has a large appetite for power, but it lacks the political experience of either Saleh or al-Islah. The Houthis have widened the area under their military control by capitalizing on squabbles between tribes, the army, and religious leaders. A newly formed external alliance against the Islamic State group, IS, formerly known as ISIS, and U.S. Iranian rapprochement. The group has used its armed revolutionary committees to take control of the Yemeni capital and state institutions, and succeeded in storming the Republican Palace and President Abd Rabbuh Mansur Hadi's residence at the end of January. In doing so, the Houthis muted the last civil voices supporting the group against its oppression in Sa'ada Governorate in northwest Yemen. On February 6, the Houthis announced parliament had been dissolved and they were transferring power to a national council, a presidential council and a supreme security committee. This confirmed the Houthis' desire to monopolize power after failing to rule from behind the scenes under Hadi's presidency. Hadi's resignation on January 22 placed the group in direct confrontation with the population and damaged its legitimacy. The Houthi announcement was not surprising, but it was worrying because it means the future of the Yemeni state and people's dreams of a dignified life are at the mercy of a gang-like militia. The announcement was the decision of a dominant force trying to complete its domination of power, and it can in no way be considered a constitutional declaration, as the Houthis declared it to be. After this, people began discussing national fragmentation. In South Yemen they are talking about an historic opportunity to disengage from Sana'a, while the idea of autonomy is also being reinforced in other areas, threatening to destroy what is left of Yemen's unity. The response of regional and international powers to the Houthi announcement exposes the deep moral crisis of these forces, who only care about their own interests, and not the security and safety of Yemenis or Yemen's unity. The U.S., for example, does not care the Houthis have taken power because of its rapprochement with Iran, and its war against the Islamic State group. The U.S. simply wants to maintain its security capabilities so it can continue operations against al-Qaeda in Yemen. Yemenis will live through another dark cycle after being let down by everyone. However, they will again rise up to resist oppression and aggression as they have in the past. Yemeni journalist and novelist Bushra al-Maqtari was awarded the German Johann Philipp Palm Award on May 16, 2020 for freedom of speech and the press. A private German foundation from the town of Schorndorf grants the prize annually. A German translation of al-Maqtari's latest book, What You Have Left Behind, Voices from the Land of the Forgotten War, was published by Ullstein Book Verlag, and released in early June 2020 in hard copy. The German-language e-book translation has been available on Amazon since March 2019. Al-Maqtari will accept the prize at an awards ceremony scheduled for December 2020. Al-Maqtari was a resounding voice for the people during the 2011 revolution in Yemen as an activist and writer. Before and after the revolution of 2011, she stood publicly and without hesitation for the dignity of the victims and those oppressed by the government and militias. Alongside comrades from various political and social backgrounds, she struggled to reshape political and social life in Yemen, and to place justice, freedom, and human dignity at the center of any future participatory democratic system of governance. Since the end of 2014, Yemen has hurtled further and further into war. The Yemeni state, which was already weak, has fragmented into various statelets. Revolutionaries from the public squares have divided themselves into opposing political factions, and many intellectuals and journalists have allied themselves with different identity groups and regional powers. Too often these intellectuals justify and condone the violent actions of these groups, instead of standing for the collective interests of Yemenis. They have become beneficiaries of the tragedies that the poor people and the victims of the war have experienced. Al-Madaniya magazine interviewed Bushra al-Maqtari about these issues and concerns at her residence in Sana'a. You have written novels, news articles, and a book about the history of the Socialist Party in South Yemen, in dialogue with the Lebanese author Fawaz Trabulsi. This time, you have published a book of documentary narratives that tells the stories of 43 families affected by the war's destruction, killing, and displacement. What motivated you to write this book and to give it this form? First of all, I would like to express my great appreciation for the content that you are publishing on the website of Al-Madaniya magazine. I have been a great admirer and follower of Al-Madaniya magazine since it was first published. Its analytical, cultural, anthropological, and humanitarian work documents Yemen's lives and how they have transformed during this war. It is an important addition for us as Yemenis. Once again, I would like to congratulate you on this unique effort. When you live through the narrative of the war, with death, destruction, killing, displacement, famine, and humiliation, with your personal life and social space being taken away, including your human right to live a normal life, and you are placed in categories based on your geographic origin, with your identity as a Yemeni being taken away by the parties to the war, you face a real test in trying to face this destruction, which impacts you and those around you. The warring parties have undermined everything, leaving most of us with no choice but to die. That is why I tried to resist this death through writing, whether as daily journaling or in documenting the lives of the victims of the war. I also wrote about cases of corruption and detention and posts on my personal social media account, and I continued to write articles opposing the warring parties. But these articles could not reveal the gravity of what has been done, and is still being done, to us by the warring parties, who continue to fight without any concern for anything other than power. This is how I came to the idea of the book. It was a simple attempt to document the narrative of the war and its dark memory based on those affected by it. It contains the memories of victims, whose suffering the warring parties insist on deepening and exploiting, and shows how all of the parties in the conflict, in the end, are murderers. I started by documenting meetings with the families of victims in the areas of Yemen that I was able to visit. The first phase, the collection phase, took around 2 years. Then, I selected 43 of the testimonies and concluded with my own testimony about my friend, Riham al-Badr, who joined me on the visits to the families of the victims in Taiz city. She was later killed during the war before being able to see the book she had been so excited about. There is also the bibliography, which covered more than 2 years of the war. The bibliography was a challenge for me, and it took time to organize and edit it with the help of my husband Sadek Ali Ghanem. He provided support, and helped edit the book. The review process for the book took another year. Cover of What You Have Left Behind, Voices from the Land of the Forgotten War in Arabic, published by Beirut-based Riyad El Reyes. The language of the book is literary, expressive, and emotional, even though it is not a work of fiction. You write in the introduction that the testimonies of the families in the book are, for you, a finger in the eye of the killers, and a memory to prevent them from being forgotten, ignored, or treated with indifference. Why did you choose to this style of writing? And, on the subject of language, how do you feel when you see the local media use rhetoric that aims to divide people across Yemen into regional or sectarian identities, and to mobilize and recruit followers to each group's different vision for the country? From my simple experience in writing a book on the victims of the war, you must first represent their psychological experience, living it and envisioning their private moments, their horror, and their sadness at losing their loved ones. This forces you to listen to them without censoring their emotions. I was unable to remain neutral to their plight, but despite that fact, when I prepared a draft of their testimonies, I tried to ensure that the language toward the warring parties was neutral and objective, not to favor any side. The poetic and emotional language of their testimonies was the best way to express the tragedies and pain of the victims and their families, not political rhetoric. In my own personal testimony on the war, I was expressing my stance towards the war and the warring parties and how they are participating in the killing of Yemenis, regardless of their attempts to justify their violations. My own testimony, which was a condemnation of the war and the warring parties, was filled with emotion, but still, my writing in this section subconsciously became the antithesis of the inciting rhetoric used by politicians and the media. Of course, I am saddened by the language being used in the Yemeni media, and the severity of the political and regional polarization in the cultural scene and in journalism. This language, however, is a reflection of the political reality, which the war has transformed to bring political forces and militias with transnational loyalties to the forefront. These forces and militias put their own interests above the national interests of Yemenis, but I am optimistic that this fragmented and polarized situation, which feeds into the war, into hatred and divisions based on identities in Yemen, will not continue for long. Yemeni intellectuals, in both the north and the south, oppose this rhetoric in their writings, and instead, side with collective and national Yemeni concerns. Even though they are few, they represent a source of hope that should make us all more optimistic. In the introduction of your book, however, there is a clear accusation against certain opportunistic Yemeni intellectuals. The ones who, due to various motivations, call anyone opposed to the war or anyone who turns a critical eye towards all of the parties of the conflict, a traitor. What is the status of Yemeni intellectuals after 5 years of war? How do you assess their different positions? Do these intellectuals, at their core, have any positive vision for Yemen that they are championing? I think that these intellectuals are one of the biggest examples of the ugliness of war. They have been very unprofessional. They have used the media and their platforms to feed into the war in Yemen and attack anyone opposing them. They have shown a strange ability to switch sides and transform. They accuse those that oppose the war of something. Then, tomorrow, they accuse them of something completely different and contradictory. In my estimation, their stance toward the warring parties and their convoluted positions, which always call for the continuation of the war, come from the fact that the end of the war means an end to their source of income. They will be harmed if the war stops, and that is why they continue to attack any Yemeni voice opposed to the war. I, like hundreds of other Yemeni writers and journalists, was subject to their daily campaigns to silence us and stop us from expressing our suffering as Yemenis from the war. Unfortunately, and after 5 bitter years of war, the situation has not changed for those intellectuals fueling the war. Some of them have changed their positions towards some of the regional actors involved in the war in Yemen, but they did not do this because of an understanding of the cost of 5 years of war on Yemenis. They did not change their position because they understand the real risk of Yemen being fragmented, or the interests of the actors interfering in Yemen. They only changed their positions in response to their regional sponsors changing their position towards the war. In principle, I believe that being an intellectual means taking a moral stand for the common good. In light of the national collapse that has been made worse by the war, Yemeni intellectuals must adopt and embody the voices, concerns, and interests of Yemenis. They must also defend the rights of Yemenis that have been taken away from them by the warring parties, and not become a voice for these warring parties. A large part of our problem is that local and regional media outlets give some of these intellectuals titles that they are not worthy of and overstate their popularity and credibility. Cover of What You Have Left Behind, Voices from the Land of the Forgotten War in German, published by Beirut-based Riyad El Reyes. You told us that this book has not actually reached Yemen. Is that due to the authorities controlling the ports of entry into the country, or is it due to the cultural and intellectual blockade that Yemen has been subjected to since 2015? Arabic language books, periodicals, and magazines, as well as the writings of Yemeni authors published by Arab publishing houses, have not reached Yemeni readers in 5 years. This is due, like I said, to the blockade imposed on Yemen, in addition to the deteriorating economic situation in Yemen that has affected all Yemenis. These deteriorating economic conditions have impacted the owners of bookstores and libraries, who cannot risk importing books into Yemen. They would have to pay staggering taxes and customs fees at the hundreds of ports and checkpoints the various warring parties have set up, all without there being a market of readers who will compensate them for their losses. It is impossible for Yemenis, who are facing immense obstacles in providing for their livelihoods on a daily basis, to think about buying a novel or a book. As for importing a book about the victims of the war, I think that there is no possibility of that. None of the militias or the de facto authorities on the ground welcome it. In 2013, you received the François Giroud Award for Defense of Freedom and Liberties in Paris, and now you have been awarded the German Johann Philipp Palm Award in 2020. What do these awards mean to Bushra al-Maqtari, the writer and activist? First of all, I would like to mention that winning awards is by no means a measure of the importance of a writer, the quality of their work, or their importance in the national context. There are, at the local level, excellent Yemeni writers and activists, who represent the values of humanity and patriotism, who have championed the causes of Yemenis, and who have adopted national causes in the face of the fragmentation that we are living through, but have not received any awards. I believe that the position of a writer is determined by their social capital, not by the awards that they receive. These awards are granted by institutions that champion freedom of expression and belief. As much as these institutions' appreciation of my writings and struggles means to me, the awards are meant, first and foremost, to defend the values of human dignity and freedom and condemn oppressive authorities. Personally, I am very honored for the recognition that comes with these awards, and I am happy that this appreciation motivates me to continue working to defend our freedoms. You are one of the well-known, civic voices from the events of 2011 and the following transitional dialogue. Do you believe that, after all of this conflict and chaos, there is still hope that Yemenis will win the right to live in a civil state that represents everyone, a functional state that provides justice and protects human dignity and freedom? The events of 2011, or the 2011 revolution, were, for me, a social movement that aimed to change the system of political and social oppression in Yemen. They also represented hope to achieve social justice. The revolution deviated from its track and was militarized. Then, it changed into the transitional dialogue that did not resolve national problems, but instead increased them. This was a big disappointment for me. The interference of many local and regional factors, in addition to the political exploitation of the revolution, whether by political or tribal forces or by the youth who were at its forefront, have led to the polarization and divisions that caused the war that we are living through today. However, with all of the failures and the continuation of the war, there is, of course, hope. And Yemenis will definitely come back together, if there are national forces that reject the war and the warring parties, that stand against the idea of might makes right, and of taking power through violence, that maintain and protect the national foundation that brings Yemenis together, and that adopt their interests. All that I wish for is that this is not delayed too much, because every day that the war continues causes new and direct suffering for many families and permanently imprints this suffering onto Yemenis. A still from an interview for Bushra with BBC Arabic. In light of spread of COVID-19 in Yemen, how do you see the situation? Do you believe that the de facto authorities, whether in the south, the north, or the middle areas of the country can, in any way, shape, or form, do anything for Yemenis? First, I would like to express my solidarity with the victims of COVID-19 all over the world, as well as my condolences for anyone who has lost loved ones during this pandemic. As for the COVID-19 pandemic in Yemen, I believe that we need further solidarity and condolences, because we, in Yemen, are living through a situation that is more complicated than in other countries. The war has destroyed what remained of the fragile healthcare system, and hospitals all across Yemen are not prepared to receive patients. The economic conditions are also disastrous, and the poverty and lack of income is crushing Yemenis, in addition to the fact that the war authorities have avoided paying the salaries of civil servants. These conditions have made it so Yemenis, as a whole, are unable to secure their daily needs, let alone protect themselves from this pandemic, including by adhering to social distancing. There is no state that will provide their daily needs in exchange for them quarantining themselves at home, and most Yemenis rely on daily labor to stave off starvation because they do not have any other option. The de facto authorities and militias controlling people's lives in North and South Yemen have not showed any concern for their fates and death, and the violation of people's dignity is the natural result. These authorities lie to the people by concealing the real number of cases, and they do this so that their fighters continue to mobilize to the front lines of the war and to ensure the continuation of the war economy. These authorities are focused on benefiting from all of the commitments and responsibilities of the people towards the state, many times over, while totally exempting themselves from any responsibilities and commitments as a de facto authority towards the Yemeni people. We hope everyone stays safe. We have been very happy to talk to you, Bushra al-Maqtari, and thank you very much for your time.